Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at the Roman politics of Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. Welcome back. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to be looking at Diocletian. And Diocletian is one of the emperors who could be argued to be a saviour of the Roman Empire, because he dealt with one of the issues that the Roman Empire really struggled with, which was the issue of overextension. And alongside this as well, the solution was the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. Now we're going to come on to that in a minute, but if you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe right now, because I'm doing a series on Roman politics, but I also think you'll enjoy the other content that I produce here on this channel. So once you've subscribed, let's jump right into it, and let's start off by looking right at Diocletian and who he was. So to start off with, Diocletian was the son of an Illyrian peasant. So Illyria is one of the provinces of the Roman Empire, and when you hear that, he was actually a peasant. Now this was really interesting, because previously I've discussed about the fact that Septimius Severus came from the equestrian class. So in the other episode I showed how the Roman Empire had all of those different ranks. So you went from slave, foreigner, freedman, citizen, equestrian, and then straight up to senatorial class, the emperor's family, the emperor. Now, Septimius Severus's son, Caracalla, had actually got rid of the freemen class by making all men in the empire citizens. Now, doing that basically transformed the way the empire worked, had an effect on the military and many other things as well. But one of the reasons for that was because he wanted to draw a huge amount of tax from the people, because the freemen almost had like a tax evasion loop from the fact that they had treaties with the Roman Empire from their freemen status. And even though they served in the military, he wanted to get more tax basis for funding the empire as a whole. So by making everyone citizens, this transformed the way the empire worked in a great deal and had a ripple effect throughout the rest of Roman politics. But Diocletian actually came from a very humble peasant background, but was an incredibly skilled military commander. He rose up through the ranks, and he'd been a general for an emperor called Numerian, and also Numerian's father. Now when Numerian died fighting the Persians, he was then proclaimed emperor by his army. And when he was proclaimed emperor by his army, he then started through lightning fast combat to basically go and unite the empire together, because he was dealing with a huge number of different usurpers that were basically existing at this time. So when Numerian died, suddenly Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by his army. And when he was proclaimed emperor, he then started to bring the empire back together, because there were other usurpers who had been declared emperor at the same time. So he defeated the other usurpers and then was proclaimed sole emperor, but that took him around about 2 years. And when he became sole emperor, Diocletian then sat down and started thinking about the way the empire looked, because this had been a period of 50 years of constant civil war. 26 usurpers had been proclaimed emperor. There had been generals, provincial governors, all sorts of different people, even people who had come from the slave class. Like there was one emperor whose father was a slave and then went on to become a slave, and then he was one of the usurpers. So there was a huge number of these usurpers for over 50 years. The empire had actually split into 3 separate empires, sub-empires, and then been reunited under Aurelian. And then from there was just more usurpers as well. So when you've got that period of incredible instability, Diocletian wanted to stop that. He was fed up with all of the revolts, and he needed to think of a way that he could deal with this. So he came up with the concept of the Tetrarchy, and he split the empire into 2, an eastern and a western section. Now it's really important to note here that the Roman Empire was not 2 separate countries at this point, nor even later on was it 2 separate countries. It was always the case that the Roman Empire was one empire. The recognition was that there would be 2 Augustuses, 2 emperors who would be in control of the East and the West to deal with crises as they came up within those areas, because otherwise, when you only had a sole emperor, what was happening was that the Augustus would have to go from, let's say, he had been dealing with a war in Britain. Now he has to go all the way across to fight with the Persians, or he's fighting the Persians, and then there's a war in North Africa or in the Rhineland, and so the emperor is constantly basically pinballing all the way around the empire, bam, 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 dealing with crises after crises after crises. So he's marching his army across, there's issues with supply, there's issues with recruitment, there's all of those sort of things, and it also means the empire is weak to usurpers and regional governors who go, well, he's off fighting the Germans on the Rhineland, I'll proclaim myself emperor here in Egypt. And that would cause all sorts of trouble. And so when that's going on, Diocletian says, right, no more. We're going to have two Augustuses, one in the east and one in the west. And then following on from that, underneath them, they're going to have two Caesars. And they would be sub-emperors who would be granted 1/4 of the Roman Empire. So each of these emperors, the two Augustuses and the two Caesars, would each rule 1/4 of the empire. And by dividing up like that, that meant there could be a lot more command and control of the army, a lot more command and control of regional issues, and dealing with the actual empire as a whole that would provide peace, stop for instability, stop rebellions, and stop a lot of issues that had basically been plaguing the empire with this period of 50 years of usurpers, civil war, and violence that he had seen as a young man growing up. So what Diocletian did as well was he got each of the Augustuses to actually adopt the Caesars. Now this was a brilliant move, because previously what would have happened is that emperors would be tempted to appoint their own sons, and Diocletian probably was looking at Hadrian and looking and seeing maybe some inspiration from Hadrian, because Hadrian himself didn't have any legitimate children. Hadrian was gay. When he was gay, he was not attracted to his wife. His wife had been Trajan's daughter, and instead he had a young Greek lover who he was very much attracted to and had very deep romantic interest, and also probably was in love with as well. So when Hadrian had that, obviously he wasn't going to produce any children. So Hadrian adopted Antonius Pius, who was actually 20 years older than him, and then Antonius Pius had a nephew who is Marcus Aurelius. And so because of that, from Hadrian to Antonius Pius to Marcus Aurelius, there was a period of stability, of inheritance, where the emperor would know the next emperor and would know the next emperor, so that there would be peace, no civil war, and also stability when it came to the next person coming into power. Not having to worry about the genetic lottery of basically, would you have a great emperor and then a very, well, unsuitable emperor after them. So for instance, poor Marcus Aurelius, his son Commodus had a lot of issues, probably stemming from the fact that he felt maybe that he wasn't loved by his father and had a poor relationship with his father as well. So he needed the Roman Empire to love him. And that's why he put on games and became basically spending a huge amount of money on making himself popular. And so that right there was an example of how sometimes the father-to-son system that had previously worked within the empire on occasion was actually really unsuitable, and so the adoption was far better. So the Augustuses would choose suitable male claimants who could then be Caesars, would administer underneath them, and then when the Augustus died, the Caesar would become the next Augustus, and then they would adopt the next Caesar. This therefore created stability in the whole process, and this ensured that the empire would not be constantly racked with brutal, costly, bloody civil wars, which would then cause for the Roman Empire to become weaker and more susceptible to invasion on its frontiers, on the Rhine, the Danube, the northern frontier of Britain, and right away across in Mesopotamia as well. Those were the main hot points where regularly Roman emperors would have to go and fight. So you can see straight away that Diocletian's thinking, how are we going to stabilize things? How can we face these problems and stop these problems that have been tearing us apart for the last 50 years? So that's why Diocletian in many ways saved the Roman Empire. So Diocletian made himself Augustus of the East, and Gallienus was his Caesar. And in the West, Maximian was the Augustus, and his Caesar was Constantus Chlorus. Now Constantus Chlorus, you'll probably know because of his son, Constantine the Great, who we're going to come to in the next episode, talking about Constantine and his effect on the politics of the Roman Empire with his changes and the transformations that he did. Now with this as well, they also started working on a sort of a publicity campaign, because Diocletian styled himself on Jupiter and sort of calls himself Jovian, and then Maximinian styled himself on Hercules. And so these two would have statues of themselves as Hercules and Jupiter together. And then that was a sort of a bit of a propaganda campaign that would then reinforce people together and focus in on the Tetrarchy and the power that was within these powerful individuals. Diocletian himself was also very much a conservative. He was focused upon the fact that he believed the empire was strongest when it went back to traditional Roman values. So he passed legislation against divorce, against adultery, and that wherever possible, truth should be sought in a court case that would not involve the use of torture upon the accused. So really interesting sort of things where you can see that. And Diocletian was also very much against Christianity and other religious cults that existed within the empire. And the reason for this was he believed that because the Roman Empire was starting to move away from the traditional Roman religion and the gods and the cult of the emperor, the gods had punished the Roman Empire, causing for the crisis of the 3rd century. So he focused heavily on persecuting the Christians, and alongside this as well, the cult of Jupiter Dolicanus, which was a cult closely connected to Septimius Severus and his dynasty. So because of that, they went out of their way and they destroyed the Dolicanus cult and basically wiped them out. But they had a harder time at getting rid of Christianity. So even though he persecuted the Christian church, he burnt 4 popes alive and was very much against them, Christianity seems to have flourished during that period, whereas other cults, such as the Dolichans, were destroyed. So very interesting one to see right there. He really focused on that because of his die-hard Roman conservative beliefs. He believed that with that would make the whole empire stronger and would actually benefit the whole of the empire together. He had a great deal of success in warfare as well. He was able to lead the Roman army against the Sarmatians, who had existed in the east of Europe. Following on from that as well, he also took warfare against the Carpi in the Carpathian Mountains, the Alemanni, who were a Germanic tribe living in what is today Germany. There were usurpers in Egypt in 297 and 298. And then finally, supporting Gallienus, he actually helped to bring a war against the Persians. And so when he supported Gallienus, they actually were able to defeat Persia, and then when they were able to defeat them, they sacked and took over Ctesiphon, which was the Persian capital. And in doing so, they actually forced the Persians to accept a lasting peace deal, which then secured the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire for many, many years to come and provided a lasting peace there, as well as bringing Ctesiphon into the empire for a period of time. So that's a really interesting one right there, that because he had military victories alongside his reforms, that created stability and good foundations for the Roman Empire as it then would proceed into the 4th century. So again, a really interesting one there. He also recognised that there was a need for regional capitals. So not only would the 2 Augustuses and 2 Caesars be ruling over 1/4 of the empire each, but they would also have their own regional capitals. So in the west, Milan became the centre for the Augustus in the west. And alongside that, Trier in Germany would then become the Caesar's capital. So in the west, you see Milan and Trier now become more important than Rome in some ways because the Augustus and the Caesar are going to be based out of there. In the east, Sirmium is the capital for the Augustus in the east, and that was based in modern-day Serbia or in the province of Pannonia back in Roman times. And alongside this as well, Nicomedia, which today is in Turkey and is called Izmit, was the regional capital for the Caesar in the east. So those 4 capitals would mean that there was regional devolved governments, there were local palaces, and the Augustuses and the Caesars could meet with regional governors, control the local army, look after the local civil service, and deal with regional problems within those areas rather than having to deal with the emperor having to go all the way out to somewhere like Britain, to go all the way down to Egypt, to go all the way out to the border with Georgia. All of those areas instead, the Caesars and the Augustuses could deal with that. And you can also see how Diocletian's capital in east and Maximinian's the capital in the west were not far away from each other. Modern day northern Italy and modern day Serbia are not too far away. So because of that, the two Augustuses would be able to be close and be able to communicate with each other, as well as dealing with the issues of the empire as a whole. So there were some really clever decisions there that basically meant that the empire became decentralized, but at the same time was much more able to deal with the pressures and the problems that it was facing. This also reduced the importance of Rome as a city, and Rome became less about the city of Rome and more about the concept of the Roman Empire and everything within it being Roman. Now this is a really interesting one today, because there is one sort of allegorical story of in the Second World War when German troops invaded some Greek islands, and they went up to these Greek islands and they said to the people living on them, "Are you Greek? Are you Turkish? What are you?" And they turned around and said, "We're Roman." That identity had survived all the way through until the Second World War. And so when we're looking at stuff like that, this concept of identity, the Roman identity stretched from obviously Hadrian's Wall right the way across to the border with Persia, and from Egypt right the way up to the Danube, and even possibly permeating across it and areas like that. So it's really amazing to see that all these people, even though they might have been like North African or Anatolian or German in some places, near Trier, they were also Roman first and foremost. And the other things were ethnic denominators, so they would be a part of those ethnic groups, but first and foremost they were Roman, they were Roman citizens. And the power of the empire was what united them, and they saw themselves as a part of this wider thing. And so the city of Rome became more of a figurehead, more of a spiritual idea than it did become a physical center of the empire. And because of that, the Augustuses and the Caesars, their palaces became more of the regional centers of that concept of Romanness that would then go out from there. So that's really interesting there. Above the governors, what he also did was he created vicars, and they would be responsible for a diocese. So the diocese would therefore basically have a number of provinces underneath them. So as I mentioned, in Britain, there were 4 provinces ruled over by a vicar. Following on from that, Gaul had 8, Spain had 6. So then the vicars would be underneath. So you get different ranks of government. So obviously you'd have your Caesar Augustus, and then underneath them the vicars, the provincial governors, and then obviously the town and city councils, which then would be answerable to the provincial governors, and therefore the actual whole system of bureaucracy in the Roman Empire had become far more detailed, but far more efficient at the same time. So a really interesting one to see the increase in bureaucracy that was going on even in the Roman period. This could also be seen in the army as well, because he created the role of dux and comte. And a count would be responsible for certain armies, or comte would be responsible for armies that we raised or moved around the place, whereas a dux was responsible for an area, normally overlapping with a vicarage, and that dux would be responsible for the militaries within there. So for instance, later on there's a document called Notita Dignitatum, and the Notita Dignitatum talks about the Dux Britannica, who was responsible for the army units within Britain. And we see other ones as well throughout the whole of the Roman Empire, these different duxes who were responsible for a large area of military units, and therefore would utilize them as field armies. So he came up with that idea, and it was then refined under future emperors and future military commanders. Now, even though he made all of these amazing changes, he did make possibly one of his biggest mistakes, and that was the Edict of Maximum Prices. So we'll discuss that now. So what was the Edict of Maximum Prices? Well, Diocletian had noticed that inflation was a massive problem within the Roman Empire. Even from the period of Augustus, the coinages started to be devalued. So in the Republican period, we see that the coins, the silver denarius, which was the mainstay of the Roman coinage, was around about 95% silver. And then slowly and steadily over time, it reduced in value and reduced down in value and down in value and down in value, till when we see in the 4th century, some of the silver coinage was only about 40% silver. So what we're seeing there is that the value of the coins to the person utilizing them had become worth less. And when it became worth less, alongside this as well, soldiers' pay had been doubled at points. And when it had been doubled, that meant there was more coinage in circulation, less silver in the coinage. And so it had become a real serious problem. And what's really interesting is when you find coin hoards from the 4th century, often you find Republican coins in and amongst that. So on Hadrian's Wall, we sometimes actually find coins from Mark Antony up and around in coin hoards in northern Britain, because they had a higher percentage of silver in them, so people were using them because a coin of Mark Antony could be twice as much value than a coin of the 4th century in silver. So that was a real interesting one right there, or at least, the 3rd century onwards. There were new coins issued later on, and we'll come to that in the video on Constantine. But when you see that the coins basically were becoming worth less, and Diocletian thought, right, what we're going to do is we are going to say from now on, you can only buy something at this price. So he set a price for cloaks, for shoes, for food, all of that sort of stuff. And when he set all of these prices, he said, right, throughout the whole of the empire, you must spend this, no more than this, on this item. It didn't work. The people ignored it instantly. And when it didn't work, in fact, it actually caused inflation to get worse, because people were saying, well, actually, is the pricing what we're doing right? And so they increased the pricing again. And so things were becoming very, very difficult. And actually, at this time, the monetary economy, in some ways, may have not relied as much on coinage, and it may have been payment in kind. And that's something that continues right through the 4th century as well. So even though the coinage was there, it seems that people might have had more of a barter economy alongside that as well. Now, alongside the Edict of Prices, he also did a lot of other reforms as well. He actually increased the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire far more than any previous emperor, because what he did was he actually doubled the number of provinces in the empire. Diocletian recognized there was a problem, that some of the provinces were just far too large. So he doubled the number of provinces, often by taking a previous province and actually cutting it in half. So for instance, in Britain, there was originally 2 provinces, Britannia Prima, Britannia Secunda. He increased that to 4 different provinces, and therefore that meant that the governors were closer to those they governed, and they could deal with local, regional issues far better than they did before. He, alongside this as well, increased the size of the military. So what he did was he increased the military by 1/4, improving the frontier defences of the empire, creating new units of limitani, repensis units, and also reforming the centralised army. So because of that, he then started to expand the military and make sure that there was a much more effective military system for defending the empire against its enemies than there had been previously. He also, alongside this as well, really didn't respect the Senate. So this had been something that we've seen all the way back to Septimius Severus, but this time Diocletian really went hard on it. Whereas before the Senate would appoint the consuls, he now did it directly. So he had a form of absolutism. He said, right, from now on, you don't get to choose the consuls, I choose the consuls. And he made the Senate even more of a ceremonial role rather than it had been before, where it had been obviously, right back in the Republican period, the core of the legislative part of the Roman Empire. So that really transformed things again, and it made, again, the emperors much more absolutist, that the core of the imperial power was right in the hands of the Augustuses and the Caesars, whereas the Senate was just basically a former figurehead that was kept but wasn't really involved in anything anymore. Alongside that as well, I talked before about proconsul provinces. Diocletian got rid of all bar 2, but the only ones that remained was Africa and Asia, and Africa and Asia were halved in size. So those are the only 2 proconsul positions left. All the others were now imperial, and he would decide who the governors were for every single one of those provinces. On top of this as well, the governors were now separated from the military, and this is a huge step forwards, because previously the governors would lead military forces for the emperor. But he saw that as dangerous now because of the 50 years of civil war from the crisis of the 3rd century. He now said, no, the governors no longer will have any role in the military. So you will just be responsible for judicial and financial responsibility. And he would take all of that and the proconsul role as well rolled into the role of a governor. So they would be responsible for that within the province that they were responsible for. And then the army was entirely separate. So he separated the civil service and the army would have its own career path, and the civil service would have its own career path. So the military and the civilian side are separate now. He also created a new tax system. So before, the tax system had been very arbitrary. There was a standard rate of tax everyone had to pay, and it meant the poor were hit far harder than the rich. He changed it so now there were two different types of tax. One was an income tax and one was a land tax. And these taxes that were created were now at a much higher level than previous, but it meant everyone paid a percentage of their income or a value on their land. And so that basically created much more of a, maybe a more equal tax base if it wasn't a harsher tax base for everyone. And that was then calculated every 5 years you would pay tax, and then you would have to save up every 5 years to pay for your tax sum, which was an income tax on your income and on your property, and also and was calculated sort of due to your social rank and things like that as well. So really interesting to see those reforms where he's now controlling the minutiae of the way that the provinces are run, whereas before it had been far more arbitrary. This is now a much more bureaucratic, much more organized system where you need a lot more civil servants involved in it as well. He also recognised physically for the army he needed to change some things too, because actually he noticed that the 25-year service for military soldiers wasn't really practical. He reduced it down to 20 years, because if you imagine a soldier after 25 years, those extra 5 years might make the soldier just a bit too old. And so he reduced it down to 20 years service, which again would then make him more popular with the army, and that was something that obviously the later emperors really needed. The support of the military was vital to the way the army ran and also the whole empire ran in the later period. And this therefore made the army far more loyal to him, again reinforcing that connection. He then reinstated the gold, silver and bronze coinage and set values for how much the percentages of the precious metals within those as well. So that helped therefore to stabilize some of the economy, but it really didn't have that much of effect in contrast to everything else going on at the time. One possible mistake again he made, which was almost on the same level as the Edict of Maximum Prices, was that he declared that the soldiers would be hereditary. When he created these hereditary soldiers, he said if your father is a soldier, you need to be a soldier as well. And that actually caused a lot of problems in the empire. And it wasn't just about soldiers. He actually made a lot of roles within Roman society hereditary. So this meant there was less movement between different groups in society, different classes in society, and obviously within the military. Because obviously if a soldier doesn't have children, then they don't replace themselves. And so where are those new soldiers coming from? So there would always be issues. But if a soldier did have children, his sons automatically had to go into the army. Because as I mentioned before, Caracalla had given citizenship to all of the freedmen in the empire. And by doing so, the previous system where freedmen could join the army and serve 25 years and become citizens as auxiliaries, that was now gone. Because why would you need to join the army for 25 years when you're now already a citizen? And so that devalued citizenship, but also at the same time removed the need to show off your citizenship as well. And so actually in the 3rd century after Caracalla does this, we see the number of stone inscriptions actually drop, because now people aren't needing to go and have their name carved into the side of a temple or stuff like that to show that they've completed their military service and are now citizens for the empire. So really interesting one right there again, where we get to see the effect of a decision and how Caracalla's decision then causes for Diocletian to make a decision much later for hereditary soldiers in the empire. So very, very interesting one right there on the effects of small decisions emperors make. You get a military class being built around the army and how fathers then pass it on to their sons, and that becomes a sort of a central focus, probably even inspiring many of the civilizations around Rome into the early medieval period as well. So very interesting one right there. So all of this together meant that there was a huge amount of change going on as well. The final major reforms that he actually did were to focus around the administration. And this was creating a unit called the Comitatus. And a Comitatus was the core administrative and bureaucratic function of the empire. So each of the Augustuses, and probably the Caesars as well, though we don't really have evidence for this necessarily under the Tetrarchy, would have a Comitatus. And these Comitatus would be responsible with the emperor's personal household. So they would have a corps of troops, the praetorian prefect, 2 finance ministers, a secretary, the emperor's chief of staff, and alongside this as well, important officials who would decide who could and who could not meet with the emperor. And so because of this core, this comitatus, would therefore run the way the imperial household actually ran. And they would provide defense for the emperor, but it would also form the core of his chief of staff while he was at war and other things like that. So this would be incredibly important for the command and control of the emperor when they got ready to go to war, or when they were dealing with important bureaucratic elements for the entire empire. And therefore the emperor would have far more control over the finances, over the administration and the understanding of the entire empire than previous emperors, let's say in the Principe, had done. So going from the Principe into the Domine, and then obviously into the Tetrarchy and the changes that caused within the empire, you can see that there has been a huge amount of change in the way the imperial politics of Rome actually worked. Now finally, after 20 years of ruling, and after being involved in all of this, creating the Tetrarchy, the way of the whole system, the reforms, the Edict of Maximum Prices, and a lot of the laws that he passed, Diocletian retired. Now this was almost unheard of, and everyone was really surprised about it, because previously many of the emperors had chosen to die in post, or had been killed, or had been usurped, or things like that, but instead he chose to retire. And he went to modern-day Split in Croatia, and he built himself a palace there, and throughout the rest of his days decided to farm cabbages. We don't know if this is a sort of like a little bit of sarcasm, or if he just wants to go back to the land, because one of the things about the Romans is they dreamed about viewing themselves as being like agricultural farmers, and this was the idea. And as he was a very conservative person, he probably loved the idea of obviously that you would be a military figure, you would lead from the front, and then you would retire back to your farm and you would grow cabbages. Well, he was growing cabbages within an imperial palace, so there's a wee bit of irony right there. And later on, when there was another crisis, he was invited to come back, but he refused. And the new claimants, new emperors who come after him, they actually let him continue to actually to farm, to be on his own, and to continue on there without any issues, and they just leave him be. And so in the next episode, we're going to be discussing Constantine the Great, and we're going to be talking about his influence on Roman politics, the changes he made, and how the Constantinian dynasty then shaped things going forwards into the future. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's episode, that I've been able to show you something about Roman politics, the amazing effect that Diocletian had on the Roman political system, and the kind of man he was as a leader. And I really hope you've enjoyed that. So why don't you like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you'd like to support me further, I also have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon account down in the description. That just means that I can set aside time for these episodes and to really focus on bringing the history to life for you, as you can see I obviously have a passion for. In the meantime though, stay safe and well, and thank you so much.